Chapters that you would want to reference if you're looking in the digital textbook are 14 and 15. Chapter 14 focuses on reproductive structures in an adult or a person who is old enough to reproduce. Chapter 15 focuses on fetal and embryonic development. So chapter 14 is about the parents, chapter 15 is about the baby, if we were going to say it in simple terms. Now we're going to start today with some anatomy, and so that is why there are diagrams there. And even before we do, we have to distinguish the difference between something called a primary sex characteristic and a secondary sex characteristic. Our focus mainly is going to be on primary sex characteristics, the structures that play a direct role in reproduction. Secondary sex characteristics, however, are also affected by the hormones that we will discuss. They are characteristics that are not directly linked to reproduction. In other words, you could reproduce without these characteristics, but typically they go hand in hand because, like I said, the same hormones are involved. The hormones that are responsible for secondary sex characteristics, and I'll repeat this when we talk about hormones again, in a male would be testosterone. So over on the side here I have this little picture, but I'll just highlight some of them. For example, facial hair, underarm hair, the larynx enlargement, so voice box, change of voice. Those are all secondary sex characteristics. Testosterone is the hormone that's responsible, and you could reproduce without those. You don't need to have a beard to have a baby. You don't need to have armpit hair to have a baby. You don't need to have a deep voice to have a baby. But because the same hormone that's involved in the reproductive process causes those, they're secondary sex characteristics. For females, estrogen is the hormone. It's mainly responsible for similar types of characteristics. So for example, in females, they don't get deeper voices, but their pelvis and hips do widen and change shape. They get underarm hair and pubic hair just like males do. Those are secondary sex characteristics. Does anyone have any questions about the distinction between those two? Okay. So we're going to start with the male reproductive system. In the male reproductive system, you'll see this diagram shows up on a few of the slides. So it's the same picture, so I didn't print it more than once in the study guide or in the little diagram handout because it's the same picture for them. We're going to start by talking about the testes. So down here on the diagram, number 7 is pointing towards the testes. There are 2 of them, but on this particular diagram you only see one because we're looking at the side. So I'm going to endeavor to make sure that you know if there are actually 2 of something, but you can only see one in this diagram to let you know. These are the gonads. Females also have gonads, but it's a different structure. They are located outside the body in a sac called the scrotum, which regulates their temperature. 35 degrees Celsius or so is optimal. Anyone know what the rest of your body temperature is? Yeah, Ms. Paulgard knows. Thank goodness, right? I hope we know. It's more like 37, okay? And so they're cooler than the rest of the body. If you notice my note down here, the rapid division of cells produces heat, and so there is a lot of meiosis happening in the testes for the production of thousands of sperm all the time, really. And so this cooler temperature is optimal. And the scrotum can contract or relax, meaning it can bring the testes closer to the body if they've gotten too cold, or relax and let them go farther away from the body if they are too hot. Now, does anyone have questions they want to ask about testes? This will be the day when you go home and your parents say, "What did you learn at school today?" You can be like, "Well, Mom, we talked about testes and scrotums." And that she'll be like, "Whoa, never mind. I'm sorry I asked." Now, same picture, but if we zoom in a little bit. This is a testes if we are looking at it a little bit closer. So on that first picture, you couldn't really see what the internal structure was like. Inside of the testes, there are these long, coiled tubes called seminiferous tubules. And so it's not just one solid structure, but a whole bunch of these little tubes coiled up inside of it. There are also cells in between the tubes. Interstitial, so inter means between. So in between these little tubes, there are interstitial cells, and they secrete hormones, and the one that we'll focus on mainly is testosterone. So within the testes, there are these little tubes, and in between the tubes, there are interstitial cells that secrete hormones. Now, there are other structures mentioned on this picture, but it's going to take me a few slides to talk about all of them. Anyone want to ask anything about the testes? Okay, so we got the testes inside of the scrotum, within the testes, seminiferous tubules, and interstitial cells. Now, if I were to zoom in on one of those seminiferous tubules and take a cross section of it, that's what we're looking at here. So this round circle here, that is the outside of one of the tubes. So hopefully you can see there are several tubes in this particular picture, but there are also cells in between the tubes that are on the outside of them. So sperm are produced in the seminiferous tubules, and that's through the process of spermatogenesis. We already learned what spermatogenesis was way back at the beginning. Remember, spermatogenesis is meiosis, but specifically for sperm cells. Spermatogenesis and just generic meiosis are basically the same process. We get 4 cells of equal size and equal chromosome content produced at the end. We have reduction division. If we're talking about spermatogenesis, we'll see goes from the outside to the inside. Now, if I take a look at the numbers on the picture, number 1, this kind of odd-shaped cell that's a slightly darker color than the others, is a Sertoli cell. The Sertoli cells, in terms of their shape, are kind of like the hypothalamus. It's not a shape that I can easily describe with words. It's a weird, non-symmetrical shape. Sertoli cells, though, you'll be able to distinguish because they'll be bigger and a different shape than the rest of the little round cells that are going through meiosis. So these Sertoli cells support the process of spermatogenesis. They also produce a hormone called inhibin, and when we talk about hormone feedback loops, I hope you look at that name and you're like, oh, that almost sounds like inhibit, and that's kind of what it does. So number 1 is the Sertoli cell. The whole circle there is our seminiferous tubule. Does anyone have questions about either of those two? Okay. So, same picture, but the other numbers. Number 2 is pointing to an immature cell. By immature, I mean near the beginning of meiosis. It hasn't finished going through the process yet. So my immature cells lie towards the outside. And as I move towards the center, I find mature-looking sperm cells. So notice how in the center, you see little tadpole-like structures that have a head and a tail, what you would imagine a sperm to look like. So near the outer portion of the seminiferous tubule, we have our immature cells that haven't finished going through the process of meiosis. So I just repeated there, spermatogenesis occurs from the outside to the inside. If I looked at the outside, those are the cells at the beginning of meiosis. And as they move towards the inside, they move towards the end of the process. So number 3 is pointing at a mature sperm cell. The interstitial cells are number 4. And I pointed them out earlier, and this is just one of them. There are a whole bunch of them here. They are outside the tubules. So remember I said inter means between. So these interstitial cells are between the seminiferous tubules. Now, something to note. Interstitial cell is the word that you would see on the diploma. But in other sources, you might see these referred to as Leydig cells. L-E-Y-D-I-G, Leydig cells. I will do my best to only call them interstitial cells, but this is an example where when I learned it, it was called a Leydig cell. It's the same cell, just the terminology is different. So you might see these referred to as Leydig cells if you're looking stuff up on the internet. Now these are the cells that are producing testosterone. So I have cells inside the seminiferous tubule and cells outside. The sperm cells, at whatever stage of meiosis they are inside the seminiferous tubule. Now this picture came off of a diploma, so that was something that you had to identify on a diploma in the past. And so that's why I'm making sure that you can identify all of those things here. Does anyone have questions they want to ask about seminiferous tubules zoomed in? Now remember, this is just one. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of these, all coiled up inside each of the two testes. So lots of this happening. Now, if we take a look at a sperm a little more specifically, it has 3 parts that make it look like a tadpole. The first part is the head. The head, if we look at the zoomed in part here, has something called an acrosome at the top or the tip of it. So this layer right here, right at the top, that's the acrosome. It contains the enzymes that are necessary a bit later on. When we talk about fertilization, the sperm has to penetrate the outer layer of the ovum. The ovum is the fancy word for the egg. Ovum is singular. If I wanted to say more than one of them, I would say ova. So you'll see these words come back again, but ovum is the egg. Then there is the mid piece here. It contains mitochondria. That's the plural. Mitochondrium is the singular. So just keep that in mind. And that's because it's going to require lots of energy. We'll talk later about the epic journey that the sperm has to go on. So it needs lots of energy to get from where it's produced to where it eventually needs to go if fertilization is going to happen. The last piece is the tail or the flagella, and that's for mobility. Now, kind of near the end, we'll talk about some technologies, and specifically with reference to fertility or the lack of fertility. And the tail or the flagella is one of the structures that could be not functioning well in a sperm that could lead to reduced fertility for a male. So we're going to go back out, or zoom back out to that first original picture. So this was the same picture that was on the first slide. Now, I'm still talking about sperm. So when I say from each testicle they are pushed, I mean the sperm. So from the testes, number 7, they are pushed towards the epididymis, number 6. The epididymis looks like the hat or the hair that is sitting on top of the testes. So it's that little bit of tissue on top. That is where they finish their development and finally become mobile so that they can swim, so that they can move their tail. So number 6 is this sort of lighter colored piece that's sitting right on top of the testes. Epididymis is a weird word to spell. I always have to stop when I'm writing epididymis and remind myself that it goes 2 I's, then a Y, then an I. If you were to misspell the word epididymis, it would be unlikely that I would dock marks unless I could not tell what you were writing. And as a side note, if I wanted to say the plural of epididymis, it's epididymides, which I never ever said or used until it showed up on a diploma one time. So, because a lot of these words take their root in Latin or some other language, sometimes the plural form of the word is a little bit weird, maybe not what you would expect in standard English. So please use contextual clues. If the word starts with the same chunk of letters but ends differently, it's probably that weird plural singular thing for words that take their root in another language. Does anyone want to ask questions there? I feel like an English teacher as well as bio teacher right now. Then they, and they are the sperm, because I'm still talking about sperm, go to the Vas Deferens. So number 5 is pointing at this tube. So it goes upwards, kind of loops around here. That's the Vas Deferens. That, and I'll mention this again later, if a person were to have a vasectomy, that is the tube that is getting snipped, the Vas Deferens. It leads towards this little piece, which is called the ejaculatory canal. It doesn't have a number on the picture, but I'm just telling you what that is. And then the tube, and you notice it's just one continuous tube, but we're just changing the name of it as we go along. So first it's the Vas Deferens. Then over here where it meets up with other stuff, the ejaculatory canal. And then down here towards the end, it's called the urethra. So the urethra is labeled and the Vas Deferens is labeled. And it's just one continuous tube, but we're changing the name as it hooks up with different structures. Now, something that I didn't label, or that's not labeled, but that is there, is this large round structure here. That is the bladder, which is not part of the reproductive system, but it is attached to the urethra. And so there is a shared passageway between the excretory and the reproductive systems. And you probably learned about the urethra maybe in Bio 20? Yeah, maybe. I mean, all depends when you did Bio 20 and what we had to simplify. But you should have learned about the urethra in Bio 20. So we've labeled everything on the diagram except 1, 2, and 3. Okay? So 4 is the urethra, 5 is the Vas Deferens, 6 is the Epididymis, 7 testes. Does anyone want to ask anything about any of those structures so far? Now, numbers 1, 2, and 3 are producing substances that are not sperm, but that are going to contribute to semen, which is the fluid that will eventually be ejaculated. So when the sperm pass by these 3 structures, they're mixed with some liquids. So sperm don't actually go into those structures. If you compare it to your digestive system has accessory organs, like your gallbladder, like your pancreas. They're making enzymes and putting them into your digestive tract. Same sort of process here. Number 1 is pointing at the seminal vesicles, and you'll notice I put an S there because there are 2 of them. There's 1 on each side, just like the testes. They produce this sort of mucus-like fluid that contains fructose. Fructose is a sugar. You need sugar for energy. And we mentioned a couple slides ago that sperm have mitochondria so that they can process this. But sperm have a big, long, treacherous journey, and so they need this fructose. The fluid also has a hormone called a prostaglandin in it. Those cause contractions of the muscles of the uterus that can help sperm cells move if they make it that far. We'll actually talk about prostaglandins again when we talk about the birth of a baby, because they cause the contractions of the uterus, which is where the baby is right before it's born. There's also the prostate and the bulbourethral, or more commonly known as Cowper's gland. So prostate is number 2, Cowper's is number 3. This is a case where, even though bulbourethral is the technical term, it's always called Cowper's gland on the diploma. So that's what we'll call it. Prostate 2, Cowper's 3. They secrete mucus liquids as well as something that's alkaline. There is a very acidic environment that they have to pass through. They have to neutralize the acids of urine that's also going to pass through the urethra. But there's also the acidic environment of the vagina if they make it that far. Now sperm plus these fluids form what we call semen or seminal fluid. So it's sperm plus those 3 things. Now, does anyone have questions they want to ask about these accessory organs that are producing fluids? Okay. So the seminal vesicles have the sugar, the prostate and Cowper's have this alkali mucousy fluid. Now, once the sperm have passed by those 3 structures, so remember they started in the testes, epididymis, Vas Deferens, ejaculatory duct, as they pass through those 3 structures, now they're on their way to the urethra. So sensory stimulation, so think of sensory neurons, same type of deal. Arousal and muscle contractions trigger ejaculation. And this is due to smooth muscles and quite a bit of sympathetic nervous system innervation. So reference back to the unit that we did before. Now I think, yeah, so before I go on to the next one, does anyone have questions that they want to ask? Yes, yeah. So folks, the photo that I was using, this image, shows a side view of the male reproductive system. And this is the, I think, diagram of choice for diploma exam makers. But I always like to make sure you see different versions of diagrams so that you get used to recognizing the location of structures with reference to each other. So this last diagram here shows the male reproductive system, but from the front instead of from the side, so that you can get a good impression of which structures there are one of and two of, and where they are with reference to each other, just from a different angle. So I'm not going to try to write on the smartboard because we know how poorly that's going to go, but I will just say what they are. So if I start on the top left, it's pointing at one of the two seminal vesicles. On this picture, they're colored yellow for some reason. Please don't take this color scheme as an accurate portrayal of what color things are. Most of your internal structures are beige or brown or red, depending on whether there's blood in them or not. The structure below that, so the second line on the left pointing to that green thing, is the prostate. The next line on the left pointing to the tube in the center, that's the urethra. Over here, it's pointing to the structure that's just on the top of the testes, so the epididymis. So when you spell epididymis, two I's, then a Y, then an I. That's how you spell it. Down here at the bottom, it's pointing to the scrotum, which wasn't labeled on the other picture, but you can see it's the skin surrounding. On the bottom right, that's one of the two testes. Second up from the bottom on the right is pointing to the actual tissue of the penis itself. Next line up is this little round red gland, so that's cowpers. The next line here, and it kind of crosses over, but you can see it's pointing to this tube that's leading from the testes and the epididymis upward. So that's the Vas Deferens. The next line is actually identifying the bladder, so it's pointing to that big red structure in the middle. That's the bladder. And this line up here is pointing to a ureter. That's the tube that goes from your bladder to your kidney. It's not part of the reproductive system, but it is attached there. And so sometimes you'll see structures that are not part of the system that you're on. And I'd just like for you to know what they are.